Hey guys, so I want to talk today about the difference between high bar squat and low bar squat, some of the pros and cons, and some reasons why you might use one version of squatting over the other. So first of all, let's look at the differences between the high bar back squat and the low bar back squat. Starting with the high bar, I'm going to have a position with my hands wide enough that allows me to have more or less neutral wrists. They don't have to be perfectly neutral whenever you're squatting, but ideally they would be. And as I step under the bar, it's going to sit on top of my traps right here. Okay? So as I step back and I start to squat, what's going to happen is what you'll see here with my wrists, or my elbows, I'm sorry, is that my elbows can be right underneath, or my elbows will be slightly back with a little bit of an extension on my wrists, but they're not back, my elbows aren't back very much, okay? I like to squat here with my elbows more directly next to my ribs underneath the bar, but that's my preference. Either one is fine for the high bar back squat. Now, to initiate this movement, just like any squat, you're going to start by pushing your butt back to start to shift that load to your posterior chain, and then your knees are going to go out. You're going to drop straight down, keeping your torso as vertical as you can until your butt drops below your knees, and then you're going to come straight back up. Notice how the angle of my chest is not dipping forward that much. I'm staying more or less vertical. This is the high bar back squat. Now, let's look at the low bar back squat and some of the differences there. So the big difference with the low bar, and the reason why it's called low bar, is because it doesn't sit on top of my traps. Instead, it's going to sit underneath my traps, really into that groove of muscles between your traps here and your anterior deltoid here. There's a little notch that the bar will slide into whenever you get into the low bar position. Now, when I'm here, notice how I have this false grip on the bar. I don't have a whole grip, and my elbows are much farther back than what you saw with the high bar back squat. In fact, if I pull my elbows back, it provides a cue for me to keep my chest proud. Now, with my stance here, my elbows back, I can breathe and brace, same thing. I'm going to initiate the movement by pushing my butt back, just that subtle shift right there. Again, the idea here is to start to shift the load to the posterior chain. Then I'm going to drop down, but look what's happening to the angle of my torso as I squat here. It's much farther forward as I get into the bottom position. My butt can still go below the level of my knees, but my chest is going to be much farther forward. Now that's okay, it's completely safe so long as I keep my back straight, and it's still a strong position because the bar, even though it's about 3 inches lower on my back, it feels significantly lower, and so at that bottom position I still feel very strong. It's closer to the center line of my body, and so I still have a lot of ability to push and extend my hips with my posterior chain. Now, let's talk about a little bit about two of the main priorities whenever you're squatting. The first priority is, of course, to keep a stable, neutral spine throughout the movement. You're going to use your midsection muscles. You're going to use breathing and bracing to do that. And but also part of that is the mobility of your hips that allows you to do that as well. Then the second priority with squatting is to transfer the load that you're working at to your posterior chain, to the biggest muscles of your body, which are in your posterior chain, and those are the hamstrings, the butt, and your spinal erectors. Now, as we squat below parallel, right when we get below parallel, that's when that transfer happens fully. If you are stopping your squat shallow, then all of the load is not transferring completely to those biggest muscles. And we want to be able to generate the most work and the most power with those muscles. So, as you saw in my demonstration, you can conclude that the high bar and the low bar meet both of those priorities. I can keep a stable and neutral spine, And I can transfer all of the load to my posterior chain, to those powerful muscles. I can develop powerful pressing muscles with my legs in both variations. So why would you pick one over the other? A couple of things come into play. Number one, your sport. And number two, your mobility. Now, the advantage of a high bar back squat, and why I believe that in recent times a bias towards high bar has come into a lot of gyms like ours, is because of its transferability to Olympic weightlifting. But here's the thing. Here's sort of the reality check with Olympic weightlifting. If you're not competing with it, how important is it really? There are lots of ways to develop power and to have fun while you're training other than Olympic weightlifting and its variations, all right? There are only two sports that use Olympic weightlifting in a competition setting: Olympic weightlifting and CrossFit. If you're not competitive in one of those two things, high bar back squat, while it may have great transferability to those activities, isn't necessarily aligned with your goal. So it's just going to take an honest assessment for you on whether or not it's important. Now, if you have the mobility to have a really solid high bar back squat, there's no reason for you not to, even if you just enjoy doing it. But again, that would be a situation of preference versus necessity for you. You would prefer to do it rather than needing to do it because it's important for your competition. Now, the second thing is mobility. And this is where it really comes into play for a lot of athletes, especially older athletes. High bar back squat has a lot of demand on your hips, your psoas, to keep your low back stable in that bottom position, your knees, and also your ankles. As you're doing that high bar back squat, at the bottom position, you're going to have a lot more ankle dorsiflexion forward over the feet as you're squatting. So if you have a history of sprained ankles or anything like that, your ability to dorsiflex forward in that bottom position may not be there. I know I have a history of injuries with my left ankle, and as you see here, as I squat down, my left heel wants to pick up. I'm sort of at the point where I need to start transitioning to that high bar back squat, okay? So mobility is going to play a very big role in which one you choose, and that may be a necessity thing. You may not want to switch to that high bar back squat, but it may be necessary in order to fit the mobility that you have through your hips, knees, and arms. And here's the thing, remember, whatever camp you're going to end up falling into, and whether or not you do it for preference or necessity, both variations of the squat are going to achieve the main goal of squatting.